I was asked if I would give a bit of an overview of what the 2025 goals are of our CABC, because quite often if you're reading our literature or hearing any of us speak, you'll hear us allude to the 2025 goals. And then what are they, where are we at with them, and how can you plug in? So we have about a half hour for this, and so let's just launch in. I'm just going to have to be we'll go to the first slide. It's not opening it? Okay, let's just follow along on the handouts, okay? And when Dr. Peter Reed first came on about 6 years ago or thereabouts as executive minister for our Convention of Atlantic Baptist Churches, the council of our CABC asked Peter to respond to the question essentially that if we were faithful as a convention body, if we were faithful to the mission that God has for us in these next 15 plus years, what would our convention look like by the year 2025? In other words, to give a proposal or his view of what God was calling us to over these next 15 years for the year 2025. So as Peter first, there's a number of submissions, but Peter put together an overview, and then it became a report that Peter and council worked on, and then by 2011 it was brought to our Oasis Assembly, the assembly of our churches, and adopted by them. And primarily the goals were there's a number you can look at. These can be found even on our website. But I usually talk about 4 primary goals. And so the first is the goal of 65 new congregations. We as a denomination, church planting is in our DNA. We are a denomination, of 450 plus churches, and each of those churches at one point in their past were planted, established by someone. Our best years, if you will, when you look into our history, it was in the 19th century, through the 1800s, that we were going gangbusters, at church planting. In fact, one of the things I may say later in the workshop as well, but 70% of our CABC churches today, roughly speaking, about 70% were planted, established, got their beginning before the year 1900. It was just amazing what was going on. In fact, how many of you here today, I sometimes ask this, and I know in the Moncton area we'd have churches planted after 1900, but if you know the year your church would have begun, for how many of you here would your church have begun before the year 1900? Can you just put up your hand? So if you look around you, we come from churches that have long and rich history and heritage. I would contend the 20th century we were not as effective in church planting. As we go into the 21st century, we want to re-embrace our DNA around establishing new congregations. And you'll notice that I will say the phrasing of new congregations is significant. Even though I will slip off into talking about church planting, traditional church planting is only maybe one part of what we would have in mind as we talk about new congregations. Because these 65 new congregations could be a combination of things. One is really the traditional church plant, or as they would look in the 21st century. Doesn't mean they'll look like a church plant look like in the year 1948 after the Second World War, but essentially is a more of a traditional church plant, seeing a community and beginning a work within a particular geographic area and doing that type of thing. Probably today, certainly looking at acquiring property, putting up a facility, may come much later in the process, even in these more traditional church plants. But in addition to that, we could see some of those 65 new congregations as being maybe congregational mergers, where 2 or 3 churches who are within a particular geographic zone, because again, if most of our churches, if many at least of our churches were established before 1900, there were different considerations to keep in mind around where churches should be developed. I often used to say, it was in the horse and buggy days, and then it began to dawn on me that really it probably was only those who were better to do even actually had the luxury of having a horse and buggy to go to church, and many would have been walking to church. And so churches were dotted throughout the landscape to be where people were throughout the many of the rural areas and urban areas that people could readily access on foot. Perhaps today, obedience under the lordship of Christ would say, is there a better way we should be doing this model of being the people of Christ where Christ has us? And so some of these new congregations may be congregational mergers, and we have a number of those that have been taking place even before these 2025 goals were adopted, but which continue, and I'll talk about a couple of those within a minute. Other new congregations could be congregational replants. Essentially, it is a church that says, we've been blessed. God has ministered here through the people for 125 years, but we believe we need to, in a sense, let ourselves essentially conclude our affairs, die, but let new life come out of the seed. Or if you think about a stump, have you ever been walking through the woods and you see a stump and then you see a new shoot growing out of that stump and a whole new tree will emerge out of that. That believing that we still serve a God who is in the resurrection business. That some churches will say we need to do a replant. An example of that maybe 20 years ago would have been, and many of you would be aware of it, what became the Appahock Community Church, as the little Appahock Baptist Church of about 6 people who were left, had a vision that God could do a new thing within their midst. Others might be churches developing satellite locations, where there's one church, but that they gather in 3, maybe 4, maybe 5, whatever, different locations. Another could be house churches. And this could be something new of house churches as really in a small area, maybe like in Labrador City or in some of our rural communities throughout Atlantic Canada, saying, there's a dozen of us. Can we be a house church? What would that look like? And then also, or maybe it would be a church that gathers within almost house churches, almost like satellite locations. And another, it's a catch-all phrase, I would say, is just that of fresh expressions. Because I think as Peter and the council at the time wrestled with this, there was a recognition that God was doing a new thing. And what we wanted to do was to be open to what God wanted to do rather than be trying to squeeze God to fit our models. But not really fully knowing what was going to emerge as we look into the future. So this was kind of capturing a vision of what it appeared God was at. And in many ways, really, the view and the desire of Peter and the council as they brought it to Oasis was saying, we want to be nimble, flexible, responsive to participate where God seems to be doing a new work. So this is one of our key goals, 65 new congregations. Where are we now? Well, one of the things around 3 of these primary goals, you'll hear me talk about 3 centers. Center for New Congregations, the Center for Congregational Renewal, and the Center for Leadership Development. And I often jokingly say, and you should see, the campuses we have, and the staff we have, and the huge budgets we have for each of these centers. It's none of those things. Each of us really are one person. Kevin Vincent, who I alluded to earlier, who was the founding pastor of the replant at Appahock, now serves with us half-time as the director of the Center for New Congregations. And Kevin takes point leadership amongst our staff in helping really lead us in participating in what God is doing in this establishment of new congregations. I'll admit, when 4 or 5 years ago they were talking about 65 new congregations, I thought, really? Can we even dream that large? Now, I will say, Peter came back just recently, having been doing studies that he's recently enrolled in, and he met a pastor from the Philippines, and their partnership of churches have the goal of planting 120,000 churches. So really 65 didn't seem all that large at that point. But you know, God is already almost moving ahead of us. And it's hard to count, because some of these things are like little sparks, little embers that are glowing, and we're not sure exactly what all will come of them. But we easily can count 10 or more places where God is already blessing this kind of vision. So Rooftop Community in Church, Rooftop Community in St. John, in the Uptown St. John, Pastor Andrew Glidden there. And if you want more information on these, like again in the half hour, I can't go into them, but you can go to our website. There's videos on these things. Exciting what they're doing is developing really a missional community in the Uptown of St. John, reaching out and developing work there. There's in Halifax, the Grove Community, Miro Rack, a pastor who came to us from Central Canada, part of the Canadian Baptist family there, having pastored also in the West, with a real passion to develop a new community church within. Really, it's just between the McKay Bridge, if you know where that is, and the Halifax Shopping Centre, if that gives you some geography to it. And God is blessing and going there. We talked about congregational mergers. And Steve's own church, I don't know where Debbie is, right here. New Hope Community Church, if I got it right. That's a great example of people believing God is calling us to something new in this day, and calling us to follow His leading in obedience. There's other examples of that. Seaside Baptist Church down outside of St. John, what used to be the churches on the field of Maces Bay, Dipper Harbor, Chance Harbor. A few years before that, down in Yarmouth, what's now New Heights Baptist Church, where Craig Minard is the pastor. So there are examples of that. We talked about some satellite locations or churches really coming into partnership. So up at the Point Church, as Chatham has become a second site there. And I'm sure Kevin will tell you stories of how God has been blessing through that partnership, and maybe some other things that God might be leading them to. Another example would be Montague site, the old Montague Baptist Church in the town of Montague. And they approached Cornerstone in Cornwall and said, do you think we might be able to become another site of your congregation? I'm sure maybe that there'll be time to explore why would churches be looking in that way, and why might there be an advantage through going the satellite route. Another new work that we're seeing develop is up in Grand Falls, New Brunswick, amongst the Francophones. At the same time, when exciting things are happening at the church at St. Anne, there's also those with the vision of developing another Francophone ministry in Grand Falls, and we're in the early stages of partnership with the Union of French Baptist Churches. So just to say that God is at work and blessing. How can you be involved in this? And by the way, don't panic. I'm going to be spending most of the time on the first two goals, so I think we'll get through this. You might be being called to plant a new church. Don't think that you have to be a large church, or that you've got resources that you don't know what to do with to be thinking about planting a new church. And I would contend, it's a little controversial when I say this, but we need to repent of a notion of territorialism or franchise territory. That we have to recognize, and again, this is a longer conversation, and I can sound brash and I don't want to, but I really am convinced that there is not a shortage of people to be reached in any of our communities, and that it will take all kinds of churches to reach all kinds of people. And really, and this can sound, like arrogant and know-it-all-ish and non-sympathetic, but the truth is I remain convinced out of my own pastoral experience as well as what I've observed, that what happens in your church will not depend upon what any other church does in your neighborhood around you, or if new churches develop. It will depend most on if you are faithful to the mission God has for you. that God will bless that as you step out and obey Him in leading into the ministries that you